It wasn't a gunshot, a scream, or even the dreaded sound of a leaf blower at 7 a.m. on a Sunday. No, the sound that shattered my blissful post-swim stupor was a squish, a disconcertingly soggy squish. I peeled open my eyelids, which felt glued shut with chlorine and existential dread. A potent cocktail, I assure you. And what greeted me was not the azure paradise I'd left behind moments ago, but a frothy, white apocalypse. My pool, my glorious, kidney-shaped sanctuary from the soul-crushing monotony of suburban life, was overflowing. Not with water, mind you. Oh no, that would be far too mundane. It was overflowing with bubbles, mountains of them, Everest-sized peaks of soapy, iridescent bubbles, clinging to the patio furniture, obscuring the meticulously manicured lawn, more on that later, trust me, and generally looking like a rejected set piece from a low-budget remake of The Blob. I lurched to my feet, nearly slipping on the burgeoning slick of suds that was rapidly transforming my backyard into a high-risk slip and slide. What in the name of Neptune's bathtub is going on here? I yelled, mostly to the bewildered squirrels who were now eyeing the bubbly behemoth with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. My first thought, naturally, was aliens. I mean, come on, it's 2025. If you're not at least considering extraterrestrial intervention when faced with inexplicable soapy carnage, you're not paying attention. But then I remembered the half-eaten bowl of Chips Ahoy, cookies on the table, evidence of my own terrestrial slovenliness, and a far more terrifying possibility dawned on me. Karen. Just the name sends shivers down my spine, and not the good kind you get from a perfectly chilled margarita. Karen was not just a Karen. She was the Karen, the Uber Karen, the Karen to end all Karens. She was the president of our Homeowners Association, HOA, a position she wielded with the ruthless efficiency of a medieval tyrant and the fashion sense of a particularly misguided flamingo. Let me paint you a picture. Picture Cruella de Vil, but instead of puppies, she's obsessed with perfectly symmetrical hedges and the precise shade of beige allowed on our mailboxes. Picture Genghis Khan, but instead of conquering empires, she's conquering your right to hang a string of fairy lights on your porch after 9 p.m. Picture, well, you get the idea. She was a force of nature, a walking, talking embodiment of petty bureaucracy, and she had made it her personal mission to make my life a living hell. It all started innocently enough. A slightly overgrown patch of lawn here, a misplaced garbage can there. But her complaints escalated with alarming speed, morphing into a relentless barrage of passive-aggressive notes, thinly veiled threats, and outright accusations of devaluing the neighborhood aesthetic. I swear, the woman treated the HOA guidelines like they were the Dead Sea Scrolls. I had tried to reason with her, to explain that my slightly shaggy lawn was a conscious act of rebellion against the soul-crushing conformity of suburban life. But my pleas fell on deaf, perfectly coiffed ears. She simply sniffed, adjusted her oversized sunglasses, and declared, "Rules are rules, Mr. Henderson, and rules must be followed." Henderson, by the way, is my last name. Jake Henderson. I'm 45, single, and my greatest pleasures in life involve swimming laps in my pool, grilling overpriced steaks, and avoiding human contact whenever possible. Which, as you can imagine, put me directly in Karen's crosshairs. So, back to the bubbles. As I stood there, knee-deep in soapy froth, the realization washed over me, pun intended, that this wasn't some random act of vandalism. This was a calculated strike, a declaration of war. This was Karen, unleashing her Sudsy fury upon my humble abode. The evidence was circumstantial, of course. I didn't actually see her skulking around my backyard with a giant bottle of industrial-strength detergent. But I knew it was her. I could feel it in my bones, in the way the bubbles seemed to mock me with their shimmering, iridescent sheen. And that's when the rage hit me. Not the sputtering, impotent rage of a man facing down a bureaucratic nightmare. No, this was a primal, white-hot fury, the kind that makes you want to, well, drain your entire pool onto your neighbor's meticulously manicured lawn. Which, incidentally, is exactly what I decided to do. But first, I needed a plan. A cunning, devious, and utterly ridiculous plan that would not only avenge my soapy pool but also expose Karen for the power-hungry, rule-obsessed monster she truly was. This wasn't just about bubbles anymore. This was about justice. This was about reclaiming my right to live in peace, even if it meant unleashing a torrent of soapy water upon the unsuspecting residents of our otherwise tranquil suburban oasis. Karen. The name itself sounds like a mosquito buzzing in your ear on a hot summer night. Annoying, persistent, and ultimately blood-sucking. But she wasn't born this way, you know. Or maybe she was. I honestly wouldn't put it past her to have emerged from the womb clutching a clipboard and demanding to speak to the manager of the maternity ward. She'd lived in our neighborhood for, I don't know, maybe 15 years? Long enough to become a fixture, a monument to suburban obsession. Her house was, of course, the model of pristine perfection. The lawn was greener than a golf course. The hedges were sculpted with the precision of a neurosurgeon. And the paint job was so flawless, it probably violated some international treaty on light reflection. Inside, I imagined, it was even worse. I pictured rooms filled with doilies, porcelain dolls, and framed inspirational quotes about the importance of following rules. The air probably smelled like potpourri and repressed rage. Before she ascended to the throne of HOA president, Karen was just Karen. A busybody with a penchant for neighborhood watch and an unhealthy interest in other people's business. She'd leave anonymous notes on your windshield if you parked your car a millimeter over the line. She'd call the cops if your dog barked after 10 p.m. She'd subtly rearrange your garden gnomes when you weren't looking, just to assert her dominance. But then tragedy struck. Mildred, the previous HOA president, a sweet old lady who mostly spent her time feeding the squirrels and knitting sweaters for garden gnomes, bless her cotton socks, passed away peacefully in her sleep. Or, as Karen probably saw it, vacated the throne for its rightful heir. The election was a bloodbath. Not really, but it was certainly more dramatic than a local HOA election has any right to be. Karen ran on a platform of enhanced community standards, which, in layman's terms, meant turning our neighborhood into a Step 4 dystopia where nonconformity was punishable by public shaming and mandatory lawn mowing. Her opponent, bless his naive heart, was a retired history teacher named Mr. Abernathy. He ran on a platform of reasonable compromise and let's all just get along. He was promptly annihilated. With Karen at the helm, the HOA became a weaponized bureaucracy. The rules were tightened, the fines were increased, and the passive-aggressive notes became downright menacing. She started holding monthly community improvement meetings, which were basically hour-long lectures on the importance of trimming your hedges at a 45-degree angle and the proper way to dispose of your Christmas tree. Apparently, leaving it on the curb is a blight on the community. And that's when she turned her attention to me. I was, you see, a nonconformist, a rebel, a thorn in the side of her perfectly manicured utopia. My lawn was slightly shaggy, my garbage cans were occasionally left out overnight, and I had a habit of playing my music a little too loud on Saturday afternoons. These were, in Karen's eyes, unforgivable sins. She started with the notes, of course. Little missives of thinly veiled disdain slipped under my door like poisonous butterflies. Mr. Henderson. They would begin, always with that formal, condescending tone. It has come to the attention of the HOA that your lawn is suboptimal. Or, we have received complaints regarding the excessive volume of noise emanating from your property. Please be considerate of your neighbors. I tried to ignore them, to brush them off as the ramblings of a bored housewife with too much time on her hands. But they kept coming, each one more passive-aggressive than the last. Then came the fines. Small at first, just enough to sting. But they quickly escalated, piling up like a mountain of legal documents I didn't have the time or patience to read. Apparently, my crime of suboptimal lawn maintenance was now punishable by a hefty sum of money and the threat of legal action. I tried to reason with her, to explain that I was a busy man with a demanding job and that mowing my lawn was not exactly high on my list of priorities. But she wouldn't listen. "Rules are rules, Mr. Henderson," she'd say, her eyes glinting with a malevolent satisfaction. "And rules must be followed." That's when I knew. This wasn't about the lawn. This wasn't about the garbage cans. This was about power. This was about Karen asserting her dominance, about crushing my spirit, about turning me into another compliant cog in her suburban machine. and I wasn't going to let her. So when I found my pool filled with bubbles, I knew it was her. It was the culmination of her campaign of harassment, the final straw that broke the camel's back. And that's when I decided to fight back. But I couldn't just confront her directly. She was too powerful, too entrenched in the HOA bureaucracy. I needed a plan. A cunning, devious plan that would not only avenge my soapy pool but also expose her for the power-hungry, rule-obsessed monster she truly was. And that plan, my friends, involved a lot of water, a little bit of ingenuity, and a whole lot of schadenfreude. Napoleon famously said, "Know your enemy." And while I wouldn't exactly equate Karen to a warlord, though her iron grip on the HOA did give off a certain tyrannical vibe, the principle still applied. To defeat her, I needed to understand her. I needed to know her strengths, her weaknesses, and, most importantly, her vulnerabilities within the labyrinthine world of HOA regulations. So I did what any sane, wronged individual would do. I raided the HOA website. Now, you might think that HOA websites are dull, bureaucratic affairs filled with dry legal jargon and endless forms. And you'd be right, mostly. But lurking within those digital depths were also hidden gems, loopholes, and inconsistencies that could be exploited for my own nefarious purposes. I downloaded every document I could find. The bylaws, the architectural guidelines, the meeting minutes. Oh, the meeting minutes. A treasure trove of petty grievances and passive-aggressive complaints. Even the landscaping regulations, which, I swear, were longer than the actual Declaration of Independence. I spent hours poring over these documents, highlighting key passages, cross-referencing clauses, and generally feeling like a lawyer who had suddenly developed a severe allergy to sunshine. My eyes burned, my brain ached, and I started seeing dollar signs and perfectly manicured hedges in my dreams. But slowly, painstakingly, a plan began to take shape. It started with the little things. I noticed that Karen had been violating several obscure HOA rules herself. She had a slightly oversized mailbox, a clear violation of Article 3, Section 2, Paragraph C, Subsection 4, Amendment 17. Her petunias were a shade of purple that was not officially approved by the HOA's Floral Standards Committee. I kid you not, such a committee existed. And she had a bird feeder that was technically too close to the property line, a blatant disregard for the avian placement protocol, as it was referred to in the bylaws. These were minor infractions, of course, but they were enough to plant the seeds of doubt, to chip away at her carefully constructed facade of HOA perfection. I documented everything, taking photos, recording dates and times, and compiling a meticulously detailed dossier of her transgressions. It was like I was building a legal case against her, one perfectly lit snapshot of a slightly too purple petunia at a time. But I needed more than just minor violations. I needed something bigger, something that would really knock her off her high horse. And that's when I found it, the neighborly nuisance clause. This clause, buried deep within the bylaws, stated that any activity that unreasonably interfered with the quiet enjoyment of neighboring properties was strictly prohibited. This could include excessive noise, offensive odors, or, you guessed it, the intentional flooding of a neighbor's property with soapy water. The clause was vague, open to interpretation, and ripe for exploitation. And that's exactly what I intended to do. My plan was simple but elegant. I would use Karen's own weapon, the HOA rules, against her. I would document her violations, present my case to the HOA board, a prospect that filled me with dread, but I was willing to suffer for the cause, and argue that her actions constituted a neighborly nuisance that warranted serious consequences. But I couldn't just rely on the HOA board. They were, after all, a bunch of spineless sycophants who were terrified of Karen. I needed something more dramatic, something that would capture the attention of the entire neighborhood and expose her for the tyrant she truly was. And that's when I decided to unleash the soapy tsunami. The plan was simple. I would pump the remaining soapy water from my pool onto her meticulously manicured lawn. It would be messy, it would be dramatic, and it would be a clear violation of the neighborly nuisance clause. But it would also be hilarious. Of course, I couldn't just go out there with a bucket and start slinging soapy water. I needed a system, a method, a way to execute my plan with maximum efficiency and minimal risk of getting caught. So, I did what any self-respecting suburban Avenger would do. I went to Home Depot. I spent hours wandering the aisles, browsing pumps, hoses, and various other gardening implements that I had no idea how to use. The employees looked at me with a mixture of confusion and concern as I muttered to myself about pressure ratings, flow rates, and the optimal angle for maximizing soapy water dispersal. Finally, I emerged victorious, armed with a high-powered submersible pump, 100 feet of heavy-duty hose, and a vague understanding of how to connect everything together. I also bought a pair of gardening gloves, just to maintain a semblance of plausible deniability in case Karen decided to call the cops. Back at home, I spent the rest of the day assembling my soapy water delivery system. It was a Frankensteinian contraption of pumps, hoses, and duct tape, but it was functional. And that's all that mattered. It was time for revenge. With bubbles, the night was perfect for clandestine, soapy operations. The moon was hidden behind a veil of clouds, providing ample cover for my nefarious activities. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of soapy water. I took a deep breath, adjusted my gardening gloves, and surveyed the battlefield. Karen's house was ablaze with light. Through the living room window, I could see her and a gaggle of her HOA cronies, all impeccably dressed and sipping what I presumed were overpriced Chardonnay. They looked like they were plotting the downfall of, well, probably me, or maybe just discussing the optimal pH balance for their petunias. Either way, they were blissfully unaware of the soapy doom that was about to be unleashed upon them. My heart pounded in my chest. This was it, the moment of truth. I glanced at my trusty submersible pump, humming quietly in the darkness, and felt a surge of adrenaline. It was time to execute Operation Suds and sanctions. I carefully lowered the pump into the now empty pool, making sure to keep it submerged to avoid any telltale sputtering noises. I attached the hose, checked the connections. Duct tape is a marvel of modern engineering, by the way, and aimed the nozzle towards Karen's lawn. It felt a little like pointing a bazooka, but instead of explosive projectiles, it would be launching a tidal wave of slightly used, but still surprisingly potent, dish soap. Taking another deep breath, I flipped the switch. The pump roared to life, sending a torrent of soapy water surging through the hose. The nozzle bucked in my hands, like a wild animal straining to escape its leash. I gripped it tightly, aimed, and unleashed the soapy fury. A geyser of foamy water arced through the air, landing with a satisfying splush on Karen's meticulously manicured lawn. I adjusted the aim, sweeping the nozzle back and forth like a deranged sprinkler, coating every blade of grass, every flower bed, every carefully placed garden gnome in a thick layer of suds. It was beautiful. I watched in gleeful satisfaction as the soapy water seeped into the soil, transforming Karen's pristine paradise into a bubbly swamp. The scent of detergent filled the air, mingling with the sweet aroma of petunias and the faint strains of classical music wafting from her open windows. Inside, the party raged on, oblivious to the soapy apocalypse unfolding in the yard. Karen and her cronies continued to sip their wine, discuss HOA matters, and generally congratulate themselves on their superior taste and adherence to community standards. I continued to pump. The soapy water flowed like a river, engulfing Karen's lawn in a sea of white foam. The hedges were obscured, the flower beds were submerged, and the garden gnomes looked like they were drowning in a bubble bath. It was a scene of utter chaos, a testament to the transformative power of soapy water and a well-executed revenge plan. And then it happened. A scream, a high-pitched, ear-splitting shriek that cut through the night air like a rusty chainsaw. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. Had I been discovered? Was Karen about to unleash her wrath upon me? I peered cautiously over the hedge, trying to assess the situation. And what I saw was glorious. Karen and her guests were streaming out of the house, their faces contorted with a mixture of horror and disbelief. They stood on the patio, gaping at the soapy landscape that had once been their beloved lawn. "What in the name of Martha Stewart is going on here?" Karen shrieked, her voice cracking with indignation. Her guests, equally appalled, began to chatter amongst themselves, their carefully coiffed hairdos bobbing in unison. "My shoes! They're ruined!" one woman cried, pointing at her soapy stilettos. "The petunias! They're drowning!" another wailed, clutching her pearls. Karen, her face turning a shade of red that I didn't think was humanly possible, marched towards the edge of the patio, her eyes scanning the soapy wasteland for the culprit. And that's when she saw me, standing behind the hedge, hose in hand, grinning like a Cheshire cat who had just swallowed a canary. Our eyes met, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You!" she bellowed, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. "You did this. You're going to pay for this. I'm calling the police. I'm calling the HOA. I'm calling my lawyer." I simply smiled, shrugged, and turned up the pressure on the hose. The soapy water continued to flow, engulfing Karen's lawn in a frothy embrace. Her guests scattered, screaming and flailing, like rats fleeing a sinking ship. As Karen stood there, sputtering and seething, I couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction. This was it. This was the moment of triumph. I had avenged my soapy pool, exposed Karen for the tyrant she truly was, and provided the entire neighborhood with a spectacle they would never forget. But the night was far from over. The police were on their way. The HOA board was in emergency session, and Karen was plotting her revenge. The bubble-fueled retribution had only just begun, and I, for one, was ready for the next round. Past the dish soap, the flashing lights of the police cruisers painted the soapy landscape in a surreal, almost theatrical glow. The air crackled with tension, mingling with the faint scent of detergent and the lingering echo of Karen's enraged screams. The police officers, bless their weary hearts, looked utterly bewildered. They'd clearly been expecting a domestic disturbance, not a suburban soap opera. They cautiously navigated the soapy terrain, their boots squelching with every step. As they approached me, hose still clutched firmly in my hand. "Sir," one of them said, his voice a mixture of exasperation and amusement, "can you explain what's going on here?" I adopted my most innocent expression, the one I usually reserve for tax audits and surprise visits from my mother. "Officer," I said, "I have no idea what you're talking about. I was simply watering my lawn when, to my great surprise, a sudden and unexpected surge of soapy water inexplicably appeared on my neighbor's property." I paused for effect, adding a touch of dramatic flair. "It's a tragedy, really, a true blight on our community." The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly not buying my act. "And the pump, sir? The hose?" "The distinct odor of industrial-strength detergent." "Pure coincidence, officer," I replied, my voice oozing sincerity. "I'm a simple man with simple hobbies. I enjoy gardening, and occasionally, I enjoy experimenting with alternative irrigation techniques." Behind me, Karen was apoplectic. She was pacing back and forth on her, now thoroughly soaped patio, ranting and raving about property damage, vandalism, and the utter lack of respect for HOA rules. Her guests, still clutching their ruined shoes and sobbing over their drowning petunias, looked like they wanted to be anywhere else in the world. The police, after what felt like an eternity of questioning and note-taking, decided that there wasn't enough evidence to arrest me. Apparently, alternative irrigation techniques are not explicitly illegal in the state of suburbia. Yet, they did, however, issue me a stern warning and a citation for violating the neighborly nuisance clause, which, let's be honest, was a badge of honor at this point. As the police departed, leaving behind a trail of soapy footprints and a lingering sense of disbelief, Karen vowed revenge. "This isn't over, Henderson," she shrieked, shaking her fist in my direction. "I'm going to sue you. I'm going to ruin you. I'm going to make sure you regret the day you ever crossed me." I simply smiled, waved, and went inside, leaving her to stew in her soapy rage. The next few days were a whirlwind of legal documents, HOA meetings, and neighborhood gossip. Karen, true to her word, filed a lawsuit against me, alleging property damage, emotional distress, and a blatant disregard for community standards. The HOA board predictably sided with Karen. They held an emergency meeting, which I was forced to attend, and subjected me to a barrage of accusations and insults. I defended myself as best I could, citing Karen's own violations of HOA rules and presenting my evidence of her past transgressions. But it was no use. They were a lost cause, puppets controlled by Karen's iron fist. They voted unanimously to impose a series of draconian fines on me, threatening to foreclose on my house if I didn't pay up. I was officially screwed, or so it seemed. The lawsuit went to trial. Karen, looking every bit the vengeful queen, took the stand and delivered a tearful, melodramatic account of the soapy attack. She painted me as a deranged madman, a menace to society, a threat to the very fabric of suburban life. Her witnesses, her loyal HOA cronies, echoed her sentiments, adding their own embellished accounts of the horror they had endured that fateful night. The courtroom was filled with gasps, whispers, and the occasional sniffle. Then it was my turn. I took the stand, calm and collected, and presented my case. I recounted Karen's history of harassment, her abuse of power, and her own flagrant violations of HOA rules. I showed the jury the photos of her oversized mailbox, her unauthorized petunias, and her illegally placed bird feeder. I even brought in an expert witness, a disgruntled former HOA member who had been driven to the brink of madness by Karen's relentless tyranny. He testified about her controlling nature, her obsessive need for order, and her complete disregard for the rights of her neighbors. The jury, to my surprise, seemed to be on my side. They listened intently to my testimony, occasionally nodding in agreement or exchanging knowing glances. And then the moment of truth arrived. The judge read the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty. Collective gasp filled the courtroom. Karen's face turned a shade of purple that made her unauthorized petunias look positively pastel. The judge, sensing the impending eruption, quickly added, "Furthermore, we find the plaintiff, Ms. Karen last name, guilty of violating the HOA's neighborly nuisance clause and order her to pay damages to Mr. Henderson." The courtroom erupted in applause. Karen, utterly defeated, stormed out of the room, muttering threats and curses under her breath. The bubble had finally burst. The aftermath was glorious. Karen's reputation was ruined. Her HOA cronies abandoned her. She was forced to resign as president of the HOA and move to a different neighborhood, where, I can only assume, she is currently terrorizing a new group of unsuspecting suburbanites. As for me, I became a local hero. The neighbors hailed me as a champion of freedom, a defender of the downtrodden, and a slayer of Karenness.